We need to re-examine all the time the past. And by looking at the past and understanding why things happened, you can then see what forward movement is going to be and how it is going to change things.
In the early 1700s, Newton brought in his own people to the key jobs to help shore up his new position. The new head of demonstrations there was 35-year-old Francis Hawksby. In November, he came up with this, a rotating glass sphere. He was able to remove the air from inside it using a new machine, the air pump. On his machine, a handle allowed him to spin the sphere. One by one, the candles in the room were put out. And Francis placed his hand against the sphere. The audience were about to see something amazing. Inside the glass sphere, a strange ethereal light began to form, dancing around his hand. A light no one had ever seen before. Hawksby never realized the full significance of his experiment. He lost interest in his glowing sphere and spent the last few years of his life building ever more spectacular experiments for Isaac Newton to test his other theories. He never realized that he'd unwittingly started an electrical revolution. Before Hawksby, electricity had been merely a curiosity. The ancient Greeks rubbed amber, which they called electron, to get small shocks. And even Queen Elizabeth I marvelled at static electricity's power to lift feathers. But now, Hawksby's machine could make electricity at the turn of a handle, and you could see it. One centre for electrical research was here in Leyden, Holland. And it was here that a professor came up with an invention that many still regard as the most significant of the 18th century, one that, in some form or another, can still be found in almost every electrical device today. That professor was Pieter van Musschenbroek. He was trying to find a way to store electrical charge ready for his demonstrations. And you can almost hear his train of thought as he tries to figure this out. If electricity is a fluid that flows a bit like water, then maybe you can store it in the same way that you can store water. So Musschenbroek went to his laboratory to try to make a device to store electricity. Musschenbroek started to think literally. He took a glass jar and poured in some water. He then placed inside it a length of conducting wire, which was connected at the top to a Hawksby electric machine. Then he put the jar on an insulator to help keep the charge in the jar. He then tried to pour the electricity into the jar, produced by the machine, via the wire, down through into the water. But whatever he tried, the charge just wouldn't stay in the jar. Then one day, by accident, he forgot to put the jar on the insulator, but charged it instead while it was still in his hand. Finally, holding the jar with one hand, he touched the top with the other and received such a powerful electric shock he was almost thrown to the ground. The sheer power of the electricity which flew from the jar was greater than any seen before. And even more surprisingly, the jar could store that electricity for hours, even days. So in honor of the city where Muschenbroek made his discovery, they called it the Leyden Jar. And its fame swept across the world. Franklin's insight was that electricity was actually just positive charge flowing to cancel out negative charge, and he believed this simple idea could solve the mystery of the Leyden Jar. As the jar is charged up, negative electrical charge is poured down the wire and into the water. If the jar rests on an insulator, a small amount builds up in the water. But if instead the jar is held by someone as it's being charged, positive electric charge is sucked up through their body from the ground to the outside of the jar, trying to cancel out the negative charge inside. But the positive and negative charges are stopped from cancelling out by the glass, which acts as an insulator. So instead, the charge just grows and grows on both sides of the glass. Then, touching the top of the jar with the other hand completes a circuit, allowing the negative charge on the inside to pass through the hand to the positive on the outside, finally cancelling it out. The movement of this charge causes a massive shock and often a spark. The modern equivalent of the Leyden jar is this, the capacitor, and it's one of the most ubiquitous of electronic components. It's found everywhere. There are a number of smaller ones scattered around on this circuit board from a computer. They help smooth out electrical surges, protecting sensitive components, even in the most modern electric circuit. In the 1790s, here at the University of Pavia, almost certainly in this lecture theatre, which still bears his name, Volta began his search for the new source of electricity. His suspicions focused on the metals that Galvani had used to make his frog's legs twitch. His curiosity had been piqued by an odd phenomenon that he'd come across, how combinations of metals tasted. He found that if he took two different metal coins and placed them on the tip of his tongue, and then placed a silver spoon on top of both, he got a kind of tingling sensation, rather like the tingling you'd get from the discharge of a Leyden jar. Volta concluded that he could taste electricity, and that it must be coming from the contact between the different metals in the coins and spoon. But the electricity his coins generated was incredibly weak. How could he make it stronger? Here's what he did. He took a copper metal plate and then placed above it a piece of card soaked in dilute acid. Then above that, he took another metal and placed it on top. What he had here was exactly the same thing as Galvani's two wires. But now, Volta repeated the process. What he was doing here was building a pile of metal. In fact, his invention became known as the pile. But it's what it could do that was the really incredible revelation. Volta then tried his pile out on himself by getting two wires and attaching them to each end of the pile and bringing the other ends to touch his tongue. He could actually taste the electricity. This time it was more powerful than normal, and it was constant. He'd created the first battery. But the biggest surprise for Volta was that the electricity it generated was continuous. In fact, it poured out like water in a stream. And just as in a stream where the measure of the amount of water flowing is called a current, so the electricity flowing out of the pile became known as an electrical current. "200 years after Volta, we finally understand what electricity actually is. The atoms in metals, like all atoms, have electrically charged electrons surrounding a nucleus. But in metals, the atoms share their outer electrons with each other in a unique way, which means they can move from one atom to the next. If those electrons move in the same direction at the same time, the cumulative effect is a movement of electric charge. This flow of electrons is what we call an electric current." Volta's pile changed everything. The pile made Volta an international celebrity, fated by the powerful and the rich. In recognition, a fundamental measure of electricity was named in his honor: the volt.
Before Volta's invention, it had not been possible to conduct proper research into electricity. In 1820, when Georg Siemens Ohm started his first experiments in the physics laboratory at the Jesuit College, reputable scientists still believed that the voltage in a battery and the current that flowed through a wire were two independent phenomena. Ohm, by contrast, was convinced that the two must be linked by some physical law. His surmise was proved right. More current flows through thick wires than thin, and short cables conduct more electricity than long ones. In addition, he made a further discovery. Not every metal conducts equally well. An iron cable, for example, conducts less well than a copper cable of the same length and thickness. The property of absorbing rather than transporting the current, Ohm termed resistance. This resistance causes the conductor to warm up. The electrons flow along the wire. In the process, they bump into the particles that compose the conductor. The more of these particles that get in the way, the fewer electrons can get through, and the higher the resistance of that particular conductor. Every collision slows the electrons down. They lose energy, which is given off in the form of heat. Given the right material, a very thin wire can glow white hot in this way. In the incandescent lamp, this effect is exploited for lighting purposes. Over the years, he had gathered so much information that he was able to formulate a mathematical connection and express it as a formula. He discovered that the ratio of current to voltage in a particular conductor is always constant, and he defined resistance as this constant ratio. Today, the formula he derived is known as Ohm's law, namely, resistance equals voltage divided by current. How can we visualize this relationship? The simplest analogy is with a water pipe. The strength of current, or amperage, is defined as the number of electrons flowing through in a given time, analogous to the quantity of water flowing through the pipe. The broader the pipe, or the thicker the wire, the more water or electrons can flow through. The potential difference, or voltage by contrast, corresponds to the pressure of the water in the pipe. A lower voltage or lower pressure means less current, whether it's water or electricity. A higher pressure or voltage means more current. At the same time, even at low pressure, you can have very large quantities of water flowing through in any given time. This is the case if the pipe is broad. With electricity, it's no different. The current is stronger. Electrical resistance is a bit like the lime deposit in a water pipe. It slows things down, reduces the current in other words. If the resistance of a conductor is high, less electricity is transported. If it's low, more gets through and the current is higher. When he had completed his electrical experiments, Ohm was granted a sabbatical in the summer of 1826 to pursue his research, and went to stay with his brother in Berlin. Here, the following year, now aged 38, he published his results in a book entitled The Galvanic Circuit Investigated Mathematically.
With Davy as his patron and, well, his boss, Faraday studied all manner of chemistry. But what would inspire his greatest breakthroughs were the invisible forces of electricity and magnetism. In 1820, both were being studied by a Danish scientist, Hans Christian Ørsted, who'd made an extraordinary discovery. He passed an electric current through a copper rod and brought it close to a magnetic compass needle, and saw that it made the needle rotate. To Ørsted, it was remarkable. He'd shown for the first time that an electric current can create a magnetic force. He'd bound electricity and magnetism together. Today we call it electromagnetism, and it's one of the fundamental forces of nature. The breakthrough came on the 17th of October 1831, when Faraday took a magnet like this and moved it in and out of a coil of wire. He was able to detect a tiny electric current in the coil, moving one way and then the other. Faraday knew he was onto something. A few days later, instead of moving the magnet through the conducting wire coil, he set up the equivalent experiment by moving a conducting copper plate through the magnetic field. He didn't know it at the time, but as his spinning disc cut through this magnetic field, billions of negatively charged electrons were deflected from their original circular course and began to drift towards the edge. A negative charge built up at the outer edge of the disc, leaving a positive charge at the center. And once the disc was connected to wires, the electrons flowed in a steady stream. Faraday had generated a continuous flow of electric current. Unlike a battery, his current flowed for as long as his copper disc was spun. He'd created electrical power directly from mechanical power. Faraday, living in a world of steam power, was informing the scientific community about the nature of electricity. But at the same time, another breakthrough in how we could actually use it had been made. This will be the first device that really brought electricity out of the laboratory and into the hands of ordinary people. The telegraph. The key to understanding the telegraph is understanding a special kind of magnet, an electromagnet. Basically, a magnet created by an electric current. The first electromagnets were developed independently by William Sturgeon in Britain and Joseph Henry in America. And just as Faraday had discovered that by coiling his wire, he could increase the current in it produced by the moving magnet, so Henry and Sturgeon discovered that by adding more coils in their current-carrying wires, they could make a more concentrated magnetic field. Basically, the more coils, the more turns, the stronger the magnet. So what Henry and Sturgeon did was place 2 electromagnetic coils on each arm of their horseshoe to create something that was many, many times more powerful. And we can see the power of this horseshoe electromagnet. If I turn it on and use something slightly bigger than iron filings, these small pieces of iron, look at the strength of the magnetic field holding them in place. What's important to remember, of course, is that this electromagnet only works all the time there's a current passing through it. As soon as I turn off the current, the magnetism disappears. But place that magnet much further away at the end of a wire, and suddenly you can make something happen at your command, in an instant. This ability to control a magnet at a distance is one of the most useful things we've ever discovered. By the middle of the 1840s, Samuel Morse had developed a messaging system based on how long an electrical circuit was switched on or off. A long pulse of currents for a dash, a short burst for a dot. This allowed messages to be sent and received by using a simple code.
In the year 1877, Thomas Alva Edison invented what he called the phonograph, a device that used a cylinder, which was similar to some that we see in this museum, to record and reproduce the human voice, music, and other sounds. That phonograph was the forerunner of what came to be called the gramophone. Here is a very old device that was created by a man called Henri Lieret at the end of the 19th century. This phonograph first recorded sound onto a celluloid-covered cylinder by means of a diaphragm and a needle. That sound could then be played back for all to hear. In 1887, Emil Berliner based his gramophone on the phonograph system. Although the gramophone could only play records, the basic principle was identical to that of the phonograph.
The concept of magnetic recording belongs to Danish physicist Valdemar Poulsen. Born in 1869, he never graduated from a university, but in 1898, he obtained a patent for his magnetic telegraphone. It was a device similar in appearance to Edison's cylinder, but instead of using direct sound pressure like Edison's invention did, the telegraphone used a microphone and electricity and recorded sound onto steel wire magnetically. Poulsen had prototypes of reel-to-reel magnetic wire recorders, magnetic tape recorders, and even the first magnetic disc recorder. He even suggested that a magnetic strip could be placed on the credit cards that were used in Europe at that time. Others may have developed the first commercial wire, tape, and disc recorders, but Valdemar Poulsen is the father of magnetic recording.
Verbindung hat mich sehr interessiert und ich danke sehr für die Vorstellung derselben.
The industrial age gave us some amazing inventions such as the telegraph and the telephone, and also the electric typewriter by Thaddeus Cahill, who then turned his attention to music, and he created what he called the Telharmonium, an electromechanical musical instrument with a large amount of equipment weighing many tons that filled an entire building with cables, dynamos, and other electromechanical components. He then made a cable system similar to the telegraph and was able to pipe music into the city of New York so that people in New York, in offices, retail stores, and the like, would be able to hear music electronically.
If you had a way to move electrons in sine wave shapes, couldn't you theoretically, electronically create any sound? Yeah. And that was the thinking of Thaddeus Cahill, inventor and musician around the turn of the 20th century. He had the idea that if you took a giant cog and you rotated it next to an electromagnetic receiver, that you would basically be able to push electrons, wiggle electrons in sine wave shapes. If you think of the shape of a cog, it's got those teeth, right? Well, those teeth are basically sine waves. So every time a tooth would pass near the electromagnetic receiver, it would push the electrons. And then in the gaps between the teeth, it was not a push. So you'd get this pushing movement, which is exactly the wiggle. It's the wiggle. It's that ruler, except it's happening in electrons. So what would happen if you had a cog like this for every note on the piano? You'd be able to create all of the frequencies that we use in music. You'd be able to create electronic tones. That's what Thaddeus Cahill was thinking. So he built this device. And unfortunately, this was before we had amplifiers. So for these things to be audible, they had to be big. You had to move a lot of electrons to be able to move the primitive speaker that he decided he was going to use, which I'll talk about in a second. So these cogs were gigantic. What we're talking about is this instrument that Thaddeus Cahill envisioned, the Telharmonium, was essentially a giant power plant moving giant cogs, which were basically acting as dynamos. This device, the Telharmonium, the principle of it was cogs generated frequencies that could be combined in different manners to create different timbres, differing amplitude, differing frequency. It was all controlled by a keyboard. Now, I mentioned a speaker, but let's remember that speakers really hadn't been invented at this point, except for in one form. There was another invention that was becoming widespread right at that same time, which was the telephone. So it was Thaddeus Cahill's idea that you could electrically generate music and sound, and then electrically disseminate it to telephones. So he had basically created a Muzak service for the telephone. And that was his goal.
The modern moving coil loudspeaker was invented in 1898 by British physicist Oliver Lodge. And the issue at the time was that the amplifier had not yet been invented. So as a result, there were limited applications for this. Oliver Lodge referred to it as his bellowing telephone because he apparently used it to make his telephone louder. So we have the microphone and we have the loudspeaker. The final piece of the puzzle was the Audion, later known as the triode vacuum tube. This slide here shows the original Audion, which has been preserved in a museum. And the Audion was the first device capable of amplifying an electrical signal. This has, of course, evolved into the modern vacuum tube. You can see here a couple of 12AX7s or ECC83s, which are used as preamp tubes in guitar amplifiers, among others.
Это песенно-голосовой инструмент. В нем управление мелодией достигается посредством движения руки и пальцев рук в зависимости от исполняемой мелодии. Без прикосновения к чему бы то ни было, посредством влияния на электромагнитное поле около инструмента.
unique instrument that's ever been invented. When Leon Theremin first created this instrument and started taking it around and demonstrating it in Russia in the 1920s, it created a sensation. He brought it to Europe and it created a sensation, and he brought it to the United States and it created a sensation, probably because it's the only instrument that you actually play without physically coming into contact with any part of the instrument. It's all played with your hands moving through the air. So one day in the laboratory, when he was working on a device to measure the density of gases, Theremin decided to, instead of just having a meter on there to reflect the density of the gases, he also decided to put a kind of whistling device on there that would actually change pitch depending on the density of the gas. And then as he was working with it, he found the same principle of radios of that time, which many people are familiar with, you know, that the natural body capacitance affects the circuit in such a way that not only was the whistle going off for the density of the gases, but the introduction of his hand into that field would also affect the overall pitch. And so he got it to the point where he could actually play a melody on it through the introduction of his hand into the electromagnetic field around the gas meter, called other people from the laboratory around and said, "You've got to hear this." And so, of course, the next step was to actually build the vertical and horizontal antennas. Originally, he had a foot pedal, and then eventually he thought it would be so much more intriguing to have the hands just purely in the air. So that's where he developed the first prototype theremin.
You see, it's a real musical instrument without string or wind. The sound is produced electrically by means of radio valve, but it's not mechanical.
I notice you play with one finger only.
That's right, because it's the easiest way. You see, it's not necessary to touch the keyboard. But if you like, you can play on the keys.
Will you play some effects?
Yes, certainly. Here is a trumpet and echo. And bird, if you will. And guitar.
Художник воинов в числе немногих
занимается разрешением проблемы искусственного звука. Он делает звуки из простой бумаги. Немые герои будут звучать. Так выглядит в снятом виде рисованная звуковая дорожка, обычно спрятанная слева за экраном.
Since the photographic film is affected only by light, it is necessary for the recording of sound to convert the sound waves to corresponding changes in light. As I speak, the sound waves produced by my voice are transmitted through the air to the microphone. In the recording process, the original sound waves are converted to varying electrical current. The varying electrical current is converted to variations in a light beam, and the varying light beam produces a photographic sound record. In the reproducing process, the photographic sound record is used to produce a varying beam of light. The varying beam is converted into varying electrical current, and the varying electrical current is then converted back into sound waves.
The machine uses only two sounds produced electrically. One of these represents the breath. The other, the vibration of the vocal cords. There are no phonograph records or anything of that sort. Only electrical circuits such as are used in telephone practice.
Let's see how you put expression into a sentence. Say, she saw me, with no expression.
She saw me.
Now say it in answer to these questions. Who saw you?
She saw me.
Whom did she see?
She saw me.
Did she see you or hear you?
She saw me.
His name was Fritz Fleumer. In 1920s Germany, Fleumer had the bright idea of coating paper with iron powder to make a cheap magnetic audio tape. This paper tape was fragile, but it would replace the existing expensive magnetic solid steel tape and could be edited with a pair of scissors rather than a soldering iron. Floimer knew he was onto something.
Fritz Floimer took his invention to Berlin, to AEG, which was one of the leading electronics companies in those days, and they bought the patents and so on from Floimer and set up in 1932 a team to begin work on das Magnetophone, the magnetic phonograph.
AEG teamed up with the German chemical giant IG Farben to produce the world's first magnetic tape recorder. It would revolutionize sound recording. But when AEG demonstrated their new invention at the Berlin Radio Fair in 1935, it was not quite the sensation they hoped for.
The radio engineers looked at this and said, aha, this is it. Tape would be the ideal medium. We could record on it, we can snip it up, we can glue it or tape it back together and edit the shows to our heart's content. It would be a dream come true. One problem. The original AEG magnetophone shown at the 1935 radio fair sounded terrible.
The fact was that the quality was good enough for speech, for use as a dictation machine. After all, the Nazis used the early magnetophone to listen into and record telephone conversations. But its commercial potential, as AEG recognized, was extremely limited.
They instantly saw that there would be no business based on dictation purposes only. They had to have the possibility and the technical means to recording music. That would make the business.
In 1936, as the Nazis consolidated their power in Germany, the world-famous conductor, Sir Thomas Beecham, took his orchestra to Berlin and made this recording on the new equipment. It was a disaster.
It sounds truly terrible. In fact, Sir Thomas was so horrified by the quality of what he thought was tape that he reputedly refused to use it until, I think, 1951.
Then, just as war was breaking out in 1939, came an accidental discovery that changed utterly the prospects of the magnetophone. A German radio engineer, Walter Weber, stumbled on a signal processing method called AC bias that enabled the magnetophone to record high fidelity.
Weber one day was experimenting with circuits, advanced circuits that would try to get this horrible noise and distortion to a minimum and make the tape sound better. And he discovered, quite by accident, AC bias, this oscillating tone you would superimpose over your recorded information that would make that recorded information stand out.
A second test was carried out on the new improved magnetophone. It was the revolutionary breakthrough that German technicians had been searching for.
This was the introduction of the high-frequency bias magnetophone to the public. And it took place in a huge Berlin cinema, and people were amazed. That was the moment. That was the moment everybody recognized instantly that's the best method for recording music, and that will make a revolution.
And this booth, which is my booth, is the Hammond Novachord. This amazing device from Hammond was made in 1939, Chicago, Illinois. This thing can do 72 notes of polyphony. It's basically a polyphonic synthesizer in that it actually has filters, high pass, band pass, low pass. It has an envelope knob that'll do attack, sustain, release settings. It's got an amazing vibrato circuit, which I'm going to show you. And it basically has all different kind of controls that let you set the balance of volume from top to bottom. And has built-in speakers, a very powerful amplifier. We're running it out on stereo speakers right now. But just an amazing thing. When this came out, for example, Bob Moog was 6 years old. And all of these capacitors and resistors have all been hand replaced. The originals were hand-rolled capacitors with wax ends, so those all dried out. And so, like I said, 2,000 hours were put into fixing this thing up. So now let me play a little bit for you.
Hugh Lekain of Ottawa created the electronic Sackbut synthesizer in his home studio between 1945 and 1948. This is the first voltage-controlled synthesizer ever built, preceding the manufacture of commercial synthesizers by 20 years. As a nuclear physicist with the National Research Council, who was passionate about music and determined to shape technology to expand the possibilities of musical sound, Lekain achieved complex variations in pitch and tone through the innovative use of voltage control. The technique provides an automatic background voltage that can remain stable or be altered through the manipulation of the knobs and keyboard. The keys are sensitive to a vertical pressure that controls the volume and a lateral pressure that changes the pitch, producing gradual transitions from one sound to the next. The rudimentary appearance of the synthesizer, its 3 legs made of crossed pieces of scrap wood and with instructions penciled onto its surface, camouflages the brilliant concept behind this invention. Lekain's electronic Sackbut synthesizer is the precursor of today's electronic instruments.
Tell the kid here about the Sackbut.
Did you build this?
Yes, I did. When I was 6, I was supposed to play the piano while my sister Jean sang Sweet Peggy O'Neill.
The Sackbut?
It's sort of funny, you know. I studied to become a classical musician, but I could never master a delicate touch on the piano. I had to give it up. Much later, when I was working at the National Research Council in Ottawa, I built the Sackbut.
Finally!
They say it was the world's first voltage-controlled music synthesizer with a touch-sensitive keyboard. Look closely. The right hand controls the keyboard, playing one note at a time. You apply vertical pressure to affect volume and horizontal pressure to change the pitch. With your left hand, you can control the timbre of the sound. I wrote music for the Sackbut, you know. Listen. What do you think, Fezzi? I'd put it up against that old violin of yours any day.
As the war drew to a close, the plunder of Nazi science and secrets by the victorious Allies began. U.S. Army Signals Corps Major Jack Mullen and his team were given the task of rooting out new German electronics. Mullen had been intrigued by the quality of late-night wartime German broadcasts.
I thought I was pretty familiar with what all types of recording were, film and disc, and this sounded superb, and we thought probably Hitler must be having people work all night.
Then, on a visit to a radio station a few weeks after the German surrender, Mullen heard an AC bias hi-fi magnetophone.
I'd never heard anything like that in my life before. I couldn't hear any background noise, very clean, no distortion that I was able to hear.
Mullen copied the blueprints, shipped 2 surplus machines back to America, and in May 1946 went public with his Americanized tape recorders. It changed the course of the broadcast and music industries.
It was a sensation. May 16, 1946 is a breakthrough date in American tape recording technology.
The little piece of tape that I'm going to play on here was actually recorded in 1947, and it still sounds as good as it ever did.
Where the blue of the night meets the gold of the day.
This monster of the 1930s was one of the first magnetic recording machines. Today, it's the musician who gets isolated on the other side of the glass-fronted booth. But back in the early 30s, it was the forerunner of the magnetic tape recorder, which had to be safely stowed away. And when you see the material on which it made its recording, you'll understand why the engineer always handled it with leather gloves. 2 giant reels like this whirled through the tape recorder at a frightening 60 inches a second. This stuff. A razor-sharp band of steel. And when this band broke, as it had a habit of doing, everybody had to be well clear of the sharp edge as it scythed viciously through the air. But the necessity of forever joining the steel band together became, in the hands of the creative musician, a virtue. When just before the Second World War, German engineers demonstrated that what you can do with steel, you can also do much more conveniently with plastic tape coated with a close relation to rust. With the new tape, and nothing more than a razor blade, new areas of musical creativity became possible. The arrival of tape recorders meant even the most basic sounds could be transformed. Experimenting with music was no longer the monopoly of the imaginative musician. Even the earliest of tape recorders could manage quite happily the faithful reproduction of 3 notes twanged on the piano. It was the possibilities for unfaithful reproduction which also caused excitement. On this length of tape are those same 3 notes. If I wind this piece of tape through the machine by hand, at a speed which isn't constant and in a direction which is forever changing, those 3 twangs become a collection of quite different sounds. In fact, if we re-recorded this performance on another machine, I might end up with a sonata for 3 notes and tape recorder. And I wouldn't be the first.
Moi, j'ai trahi la musique respectable pour la musique concrète. Et le violoncelle de mon enfance pour le magnétophone et pour le potentiomètre. C'est pourquoi je décompte, avec tant de dépit, le cliquetis des clarinettes, le ronchonnement des contrebasses. Nous autres, dans nos studios, avec nos armes automatiques, multipliant d'un coup de pouce le nombre des exécutants, gonflant le volume des orchestres, nous trichons. Tout ça a commencé fort modestement. Un incident technique, en somme.
The world was a different place in 1949. The vinyl LP had only just been invented. There was no television in Australia. And you couldn't make an international phone call. But 1949 was also the dawn of the computer age, when there were only 3 computers in the whole world. And in November of that year, there was a 4th. It was called CSIRAC, and it was Australian.
This is the computer CSIRAC. It was the first fully automatic electronic digital computer to be built in Australia.
Australia holds a previously unheralded place of honour in the history of computers. It turns out that CSIRO scientists, without knowing about work overseas, actually created one of the grandfathers of modern computers. Unlike the other early computers, the remarkable thing is that CSIRAC, all 7 tons of it, is still around today, as are many of the engineers who worked on it. Ron Bowles was one of them.
This was something you could see, something more physical, whereas so many things today, you've just got to take for granted what they do, whereas with this, you knew what it was, you saw, you could feel and touch it.
We knew we were in at the beginning of something wonderful. It had a noise and a buzz about it. It even had a smell about it. And although only operated quite slowly by comparison with today's computers, it was the wonder of the age.
It was the war that made computers possible. The development of radar needed a level of electronic sophistication and complex calculations that became impossible to do by hand. So engineers constructed the first computers. It took years to design and build them. The first went live in Cambridge in June 1948, followed by another in Manchester in April 1949. The Americans followed in August with BNAC. Only 3 months later, CSIRAC was switched on. Two Sydney scientists, Maston Beard and Trevor Pearcey, had developed CSIRAC in isolation. Every piece was designed locally, every part built in Australia.
Before CSIRAC, a computer was a person, often a woman, who used a calculating machine which could calculate about 1 operation a second. CSIRAC was 1,000 times faster than that, so it was a supercomputer in its day. CSIRAC, though, had only 2K bytes of storage, it had less than 6K bytes of disk, and it worked at 0.001 megahertz. Whereas this computer could do, in less than half a minute, more computing than CSIRAC could do in the entire 15 years that it operated.
Incredibly, all of the software has survived intact. And now the old engineers are converting 50-year-old punch tape software into programs they can run on modern computers. Even the music that CSIRAC played is being recovered.
Computer music started in earnest in the mid-50s in America in AT&T Bell Labs, but this music, the music that was played with CSIRAC, actually predates that. This is a fair simulation of what it would have sounded like at the time. It's quite possible that the first music ever played by a computer was by CSIRAC.
Music can now be produced entirely by electronics. No known instruments are involved. Coded information is punched out. An electronic music synthesizer does the rest. This is music with a strictly electronic beat.
The synthesizer had no keyboard and could not be played in real time. Instead, musical information would be recorded as punched holes in a large paper tape. This would then be run through a mechanical reader, which operated the synthesizer through a system of relays. Additional parameters had to be painstakingly set up using over 250 manual controls. A dual-tier record-cutting lathe was built. The first tier had 6 cutting heads, each of which would be used to record 2 notes at a time. They would then be mixed down to the lower tier, engraving the final mix of all 12 parts onto the master record.
The experimental LP record had certainly made the rounds in New York City, where young Bob Moog is hanging out with people in this sort of new electronic music scene. And the prospect for Columbia, I imagine, of having a state-of-the-art, all-electronic, any sound you can imagine type device must have been very exciting.
The truth must be known, Harry Olsen wasn't interested in music. They invited Vladimir Ussachevsky and me to come here and investigate the machine. Vladimir had no relation to such things. He was, of course, at that time, one of the best-known practitioners of tape music. The fact that I once taught in the math department at Princeton made me a little more able to deal with the literature at that time. The motivations for most of us who worked with it were purely musical. There came that moment when they wanted to dump the machine. And we knew that. They told us, they said, we don't know what to do with it. When you see the synthesizer, and you saw enough of it, you realize, of course, it was a huge machine. And we had to sort of tuck it in. It's in this room at Columbia.
By the 1960s, when integrated circuits are coming in making solid-state synthesizers a reality, there's no interest in subsidizing Harry Olsen, who by this point is on the verge of retirement. So Harry, in his notebooks and some of his reports, is proposing, look, we can do a solid-state music synthesizer, desktop synthesizer for the home. He's got all the marketing, he understands the game. And RCA is simply completely uninterested, which leaves it obviously to Moog and other people we recognize as pioneers now.
Rumore bianco. Rumore bianco filtrato per ottave. Rumore bianco filtrato per terzi d'ottava. Onda quadra, trasformata con modulatore ad anello. Mistura di onde quadre. Onda sinusoidale modulata ad impulsi. Onda sinusoidale trasformata con modulatore ad anello.
At the moment, there's certainly an increasing interest in electronic music, music that is produced by electronic oscillators.
Think of a sound, now make it. Any sound is now possible. Any combination of sounds is now possible.
I think people who judge it harshly have to remember that it is in a pioneer stage as a viable art form.
One thing which is odd is that there's a missing chapter, which is EMS in all the books about electronic music. People do not know what incredible mechanical adventures we were up to.
When I started to seriously design a studio, this coincided with the post-war appearance of an enormous amount of junk from the Army, Navy and Air Force. So for someone who knew what to do and could handle a soldering iron and could design audio equipment, even if you only had 30 shillings in your pocket, you could get something. And so I was able to get started on my electronic experiments.
At this point in London's history, high modernity, London is being rebuilt after the Second World War. And I think you can think of people like Tristram Keary as dreaming of a future soundscape of London.
Electronic music in the 50s was considered avant-garde, and we were operating on the fringes of what people generally thought of as music.
Tristram, I'd like to begin by challenging you, first of all, to give me your simple definition of music.
If you want a very quick and not very complete definition, music is sound which has been organized. At any period, a composer tends to use his resources. Nowadays, we have all the resources of recording and artificially produced sound of various kinds, and the composers are using it.
With the invention of tape, for the first time, a high-quality linear recording medium could be easily edited. This was a revolution in recording.
Musique Concrete is music built out of found sound. So you'll be applying musical techniques and musical theory to non-musical sound.
So Musique Concrete was what the Parisians called music which is cut from real sounds, recorded by a microphone. Electronic music, on the other hand, uses oscillators and no microphones. It uses generators to generate things. Personally, I find these distinctions a bit academic. I don't care. I'll mix and match. I'll use some electronics and some real sounds.
Tristram developed the techniques. Well, I mean, he was way ahead of his time. And he was experimenting with these techniques from the early 50s.
But as private studios went, I think mine was probably one of the best in Britain. The BBC were fairly slow off the mark, you see. They didn't start their radiophonic workshop until probably 1957 or so. I mean, composers often came to me who couldn't handle electronics at all, and they would lean on me to come and get me to do sounds for them in my studio. But very often, I would come to a point of working on something where I wanted a certain sort of filter or a certain sort of gadget which I hadn't got. So I would stop being a composer for the time being and become an engineer for a couple of days, design this new thing, build it. It probably wouldn't work the first time, test it, get it right, and put it together, and then get on with the piece. Electronic music seemed to have no limits. You get right away from saying, this is in the key of E flat, you know. You can use any pitch you like. You don't talk about C, you talk about a frequency. We all dreamt about in the early days that it was a music sans frontières. It had no boundaries. Instrumental music has, unfortunately, boundaries by the pitch of the instrument, you know. The piano will only go so far up and down, and no instrument will exceed its range in that way. In electronic music, you can theoretically go from the highest notes you can hear to the lowest notes you can hear, the entire audio range. People didn't take it seriously at first. I couldn't get any royalties on it, for example, from the Performing Rights Society, because they said it's not music.
But in the 60s, we were sort of at a peak of our belief in science and technology. Trips to the moon, trips to Mars, nuclear power stations.
In terms of the scientific revolution,
that Britain was going to move ahead with science and technology. If you think of electronic music in that context, it kind of fits in. You know, here was the science and technology of music being pushed to the next level.
I don't know quite how I came into electronic music itself. I like doing experimental music by recording sounds. And it was very early on that I realized that cutting tape was a hopeless procedure.
Because the way that electronic music was made back then was with essentially quarter-inch tape, and that's a very time-consuming process. So I think a lot of people, including Peter, were thinking, if only we could have an electronic way of doing this, where we could make one sound after another, and that device that makes one sound after another is called a sequencer.
So my first searches were to get somebody who could design a sequencer, but nobody seemed to be able to do it, until somebody said that I should go and see David Cockrell.
Peter had some technical ability, but David Cockrell, as Peter would describe him, was his kind of electronic genius.
I would say some mad idea. Can we have this? I want this. And he would produce it. He would understand exactly what my pathetic way of putting something was. He would be able to interpret it into a concrete electronic idea and make the bloody thing. And it worked. And very soon he realized that what we needed, the ultimate sequencer, was not going to be something which he could build or another engineer could build, but would be quite simply a digital computer.
Well, a PDP-8 mini computer was the first, well, it was the first cheap computer, but cheap at that time was £5,000, which was not at all cheap in terms, well, as much as a house.
I was lucky in those days to have a rich wife, and so we sold her tiara and we swapped it for a computer. And this was the first computer in the world in a private house.
botany, where Peter Zinoviev has a hobby which is strictly for boffins. He keeps it in his garden shed, and it's called Digital PDP 8/S. Yes, it's a computer, and it has a hobby too, composing music. Peter helps with the ideas, but the actual performance is all Digital's work.
Also, it was very lonely. I had no idea that there was anybody else in Britain doing it at all, nobody. Then I discovered that Tristram, who'd been doing it for much longer than I had, and that was a great revelation. He was very well known. He'd done lots of film music, and we formed this new company, EMS.
The incredible thing about this instrument is the fact that any sound can be reproduced and played.
Given the idea of a tape recorder, you can make multiple tape recorders attached to keys, and it's a great, simple idea.
Here's this thing that relates to even how the most modern music is being made.
Hello there. I suppose you thought you were listening to a long playing record just then. Well, you weren't. You were listening to a new instrument that David Nixon and I have helped develop in this country. It makes the actual sounds of the orchestra. So come over and meet my son-in-law, will you? And the Mellotron. Explain how it works, will you?
Well, actually, it's fairly straightforward. It's a musical computer, and as you know, Eric, the right hand is lead instruments with a choice of 18 different ones, and the left hand is rhythms in this half and backgrounds in this half, and it's all been fed onto hundreds of tape tracks.
All right, well, I suggest that you play a little simple piece. What about it?
I thought you'd never ask. My party piece. Bye-bye blues with 2 fingers and nothing up my sleeve. Now I'm going to add the octave in the left hand, and let's try a trombone background.
Well, that's fine, David, for the quick steps, but what about some of the other rhythms?
Here's a French accordion with a Viennese waltz.
This is it. This is where sampling started. This is the thing, and you could see his face light up.
He really did invent sampling. And by inventing sampling in the way that he did, it's not just samplers that sort of led to. In a sense, it led to the way people make records now with digital recording, because that's just complicated sampling.
Peter Zinoviev was using computers in a way that would become commonplace in the mid-80s. He was doing it almost 20 years earlier with equipment that was large and unwieldy, not designed for the purpose. And he and his co-engineers were developing things that had never been even considered up to that point, let alone considered possible.
Many of the things that Peter did were really quite advanced, and one of them was sampling. He made the first sampler that I know of anywhere in the world.
The trouble with sampling is that to get a sound which sounds the same as what you put in requires a huge lot of information.
So the whole of his computer's memory, which was about 8,000 characters, was occupied with storing this little fragment of sound.
It was at the cutting edge, and neither the people who came nor ourselves knew what we could do with this apparatus.
This electronic revolution really took off in the 1960s, when one famous instrument hit the stores. The inventor of the Moog synthesizer, Bob Moog.
This is a Moog modular analog synthesizer. We start with a very simple waveform. This is a waveform that has harmonics. Harmonics are additional pitches that give the sound its tone color. But the sound doesn't change at all. It's a static sound. And by using these modules in a variety of ways, we add complexity to the sound to give it the character that we want. We just combine two or more oscillators. Let's tune that up. What you're hearing now is actually three separate tones. Already it's more interesting musically. Now we'll filter it. We'll cut out some of those harmonics, those extra frequencies that give the sound its tone color. And if I change the setting of the filter here, I can actually emphasize a very narrow group of harmonics, making it sound like a vocal gesture. Meow. What I'm doing with my mouth, meow, is the same thing that this filter is doing electrically.
This was the very first filter that Bob Moog ever produced.
4-pole, 24 dB roll-off low-pass filter with a regeneration control on the Moog is to die for. It's just fantastic. It's so beautiful.
That 904 filter is the best thing that ever happened to acoustics.
And it's exactly 50 years to the month that Moog created the first system to be shown in public at AES 1964.
This is a painstakingly detailed replica of Keith Emerson's famous modular synthesizer, which is really one of a kind.
It was the summer, I believe, of 1969. And as far as the media was concerned, we were getting hot. You know, you couldn't do anything more attention-grabbing than use a Moog synthesizer somehow. So the Museum of Modern Art in New York City called us up and said, would you be interested in putting on a concert in our Jazz in the Garden series? The garden was the garden of the museum, was a sculpture garden. Now at the time we had really no instruments at all that could be played live. But we decided, you know, this sounds like fun. And it turned out that we really didn't have enough time to design and build the perfect ensemble of instruments, but we did put 4 instruments together.
In 1969, Moog had made a set of presets that attached to one of their traditional Moog synthesizers. And most people don't know they made this preset system for one specific performance in New York City at a museum.
All of these instruments were equipped with special preset boxes where you could set up a combination of things ahead of time and push a button and quickly change from one thing to the other. That's what you really need for a live performance. We contact some of our musician friends, put on this concert. It was mobbed. There were 4,000 people in the garden of the Museum of Modern Art. After the concert, we had these instruments made up, and we wondered what to do with them. So we told our London distributor they were available if anybody wanted them. And somehow, I'm not sure what the arrangement was, but that's one of those is what Keith Emerson made Lucky Man on. I guess that launched the use of Moog synthesizers as live performance instrument.
still use this as part of my keyboard rig because nothing else makes a sound like it.
When I got together with Zinoviev and Cockerell towards the end of the 60s, one of the decisions made was that there wasn't enough electronic concert music going on in England.
A few miles down the Thames at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, the first concert in Britain given by a computer.
The next item, Partita for Unattended Computer by Peter Zinoviev, is a true live performance in the sense that no magnetic tape is being used at all. Furthermore, the computer has a choice at various stages in the procedure, and the piece therefore comes out different every time it's played. The performance you're about to hear is therefore unique and unrepeatable. First of all, checks are made to see that the composition is correctly loaded into the computer. The computer is started and will carry out the performance unattended.
The audience is a capacity one, but the computer's performance didn't meet with universal approval. The Financial Times said, technically, it may be a triumph of skill and knowledge, but what we heard resembled the dreariest kind of neo-Webern drawn out to inordinate length.
Oh, the whole purpose of EMS was to pay for Peter's computer studio. That was his first love. He thought he could pay for it by making miniature versions of the things he had in his studio that could be sold.
And I thought that perhaps we could all work together and make something which was very profitable.
We were approached by the Australian composer Don Banks.
He was an avant-garde composer who wanted an electronic box of tricks.
And I built the box, and David filled it up with electronics.
And the VCS-3 was the first synthesizer in Europe.
So it's very, very rare for a whole new class of instruments to come along, and that's what the synthesizer is. So in that extent, I think it's one of the pivotal moments in 20th century musical instrument history, the invention of the synthesizer. It's happening, it's been invented in America by Bob Moog, but Peter Zinoviev and Tristram Carey and David Cockerell have a unique part of this by building the VCS-3, one of the very first synthesizers.
The whole thing of it spinning off into, you know, progressive rock, experimental rock music, I think that was just a complete coincidence.
Aspiring rock musicians, experimental people who never dreamed that they could own a synthesizer, suddenly it's within their price range. They can afford this piece of equipment. Some of these musicians would actually be tripping when they first encountered the synthesizer. And I think that what was happening to these musicians is that it was, you know, part of the 60s classic thing for, you know, expanding your consciousness. And here was this wonderful new instrument that could almost take you on this magical trip. And you never knew quite for sure what you were going to get out of this instrument. It was very capricious. You'd mess around with it. Some of the sounds were horrible. Could be a bad trip, and some of the sounds would just sort of be heavenly and would be just beautiful and take you away. And then I think the performers of the synthesizer, they described the VCS-3 in particular, which had an incredible range of sounds, as like acid, sort of like an electronic form of the drug acid.
Because we had very, very revolutionary equipment and a very revolutionary studio, we attracted top people of all kinds.
As a result of which they started adopting some of the ideas that had up to that point been very much in the sort of the boutique electronic studio.
Slowly, people's soundscape was expanding. First of all, through feedback of Jimi Hendrix. Suddenly, people realized, hey, this is a new way of experiencing sound, and, you know, bands that we're into, like the Pink Floyd doing it. It sort of crept up. The sound of the Pink Floyd is always associated in my mind with the EMS synthesizers, the VCS-3s.
Much faster than a human could ever play it. They got this new, very innovative sound.
And this sort of track is sort of bubbling along. You hear the EMS 256 sequencer. It engenders a feeling of paranoia, technology out of control. EMS equipment had enormous impact for musicians who really knew electronic music. Kraftwerk, famous German band, bought EMS gear. Tangerine Dream. Tonto's Expanding Headband bought EMS gear for use with Stevie Wonder. But many other bands. Brian Eno bought his first synthesizer. It was a VCS-3. And that's one of the great sounds of early Roxy music, is Brian Eno's synthesizer. People didn't know what to call the early operators of synthesizers. Were they engineers or were they musicians? Or were they, on some albums, if you look, they're described as madcap scientists. Nobody knows what to call these folk because it's a new instrument.
Synthesizer is an electronic musical instrument. It works by using electronic signals to produce sound, and the sound could be, for instance, like normal instruments like a cello or a guitar sound or a horn sound or a flute, or unusual sounds, sounds of snowstorms or birds, or just make-believe sounds that you want to make.
Can you show me some of them?
Sure. I have a sound in here that you'll have to tell me what it is, okay? You guess.
Like raindrops?
Like water dropping, or say like things plopping into water. It sounds like.
That's really neat.
Yeah. You'll have to guess what that is. It's chicken frying. And, for instance, you can see, that's a picture of it right there.
That's a picture of it?
Yes.
What is that machine?
Oh, this is an oscilloscope, and it gives you a picture of the sound. There are things that instruments can do that a synthesizer can't do. A lot of it has to do with, well, any instrument. Depends on the years you spend with it and the technique that you develop that make it expressive. This one is in tune with that one. Let's see, I have to...
What are they?
Oh, these are patch cords. These are the things that route the signal from one little module to another to get the sound. You can patch it in a lot of different ways. And the way you patch it will determine what you get. It's like creating an instrument.
Do you know before you put them in what it's going to sound like?
Well, you're always going towards an idea. You know, that's what makes you put the patch cords in certain places. You know, part of an instrument is what it can do, and part of it is what you do to it. The other part of music, of course, is the emotion and the personal involvement that a musician gives to his instrument. And that's something that I happen to feel and have with synthesizers. So I play the synthesizer the same way somebody else would play cello or violin.
The early 60s brought a whole new revolution in technology. It resulted from a breakthrough into the world of the super small, the world of solid logic technology. Microelectronic circuits, more compact, making possible faster logical decisions than ever before, the product of years of progress. From electric relays, we advanced to vacuum tubes. Then computer circuits were transistorized. But as the speed of components increased, the distance electricity had to travel between them became a critical factor. So we cut the distance. A new technology with virtually no significant distance between components. Microelectronics, in which 50,000 transistors overflow a thimble.
Max Matthews developed computer music programming languages that demonstrated the composition of music on digital computers. His programs have had a significant effect on the creation of computer music. For this reason, he has been called the father of computer music, and most recently, the great-grandfather of techno.
I'd like to introduce Max Matthews to begin the discussion of the beginnings of computer music.
Computer music was born in 1957. It was conceived at a concert of a local New Jersey pianist. I was working at Bell Telephone Laboratories at the time, and I had made equipment for putting voices digitizing voices and putting into a computer, and writing programs to simulate new telephones, and of course taking the voices out so you could hear them. And then John said, "Now Max, take a little time from working on new telephones and write a computer music program." And so I said yes. And I wrote Music 1, and you can see the waveform of Music 1 here, a very simple waveform. And the reason for this simplicity was that it was going to be computed by the world's a very fast computer, the IBM 704, which existed only on Madison Avenue, but was faced with a staggering number of computations to compute 10,000 samples per second of this sound wave. The only thing it was really good at was addition, and this happens to be a wave that you can make by a sequence of additions. So I will now play you this first piece. It lasts 17 seconds, and it is absolutely terrible. So now you can say you have heard the beginning. A bicycle built for two, our Daisy Bell, that was synthesized in about 1962 by Carol Lochbaum and John Kelly at Bell Laboratories. And they used what's now very popular, what's called physical model to synthesize the human voice. This particular example so intrigued Stanley Kubrick that he made this the swan song of the computer HAL in the movie 2001. So you've probably heard this before, but I'll play it again.
Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer too. I'm half crazy, all for the love of you. It won't be a stylish marriage, I can't afford a carriage, but you look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle built for two.
Unfortunately, the IBM 704 computer was far too slow a machine to compose music in real time. The ability to be able to compose music in real time became possible for a couple of reasons. First, John Crowning created the digital synthesizer. And second, the development of faster and less expensive digital computer chips made real-time composition possible.
the Fairlight computer musical instrument. It's $26,000 worth of electronic wizardry that's been developed over the last 5 years by Kim Ryrie and Peter Vogel. Peter, show us the amazing things it can do.
Well, here we're using a computer to actually generate the sounds that we hear. So instead of having vibrating strings or air columns like in conventional instruments, the computer generates the sound that we want. And the important thing is the ease with which the musician can define to the computer, this is the sort of sound I want, please make it for me. Now, to make that easy, we've created a light pen system, which is this device here, that allows you to draw directly onto this television screen the harmonic curves of the sound.
Now, this is the picture of a sound. That's what the sound looks like to the computer, so that we know what sound the computer's thinking about. Would you like to show us what sound that is?
This particular spectrum sounds like this.
Right. Well, now, how does a composer working with the CMI, the Fairlight, change that?
Well, I might select to change one of these harmonics. So I've taken the 5th harmonic here, and I'm just working on that curve on its own, drawing a new one. So now that curve swells up towards the end there, and I'll make the 10th harmonic do a similar sort of thing. Now, when I hit the compute command here, the computer's now thinking about the curves I've drawn here and calculating the sound that, if fed into a spectrum analyzer, would look like that, and that'll sound a bit different. You can hear the higher harmonics growing in the duration of the sound.
And that's the kind of experimentation that a composer would engage in. But if he wanted a particular sound, the sound of a church bell or a trumpet or a violin, what does he do?
Well, in those circumstances, we can simply plug a microphone into the machine and tell it, OK, computer, here's a sample of the sound that I want. See what you can do with it. So, for example, with the human voice, we can say, blah. And there's a picture of that blah.
Right, so that's the trace of that. And you can then put that through the unit? Blah, 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 blah. That's rather cute, isn't it? Now, the machine can do just about everything. Can it play itself, as it were?
Sure, that's another thing that the computer is very useful for. A lot of musicians can't play the keyboard, such as myself, and so I was forced to invent some way of doing it. And for that purpose, there's a special language called music composition language, which is very easy for a musician to use, wherein you just type in, I want you to play this particular piece on this particular instrument, that on a different instrument, and you type in each note, so you type in A, B, C, D. And
the computer does it?
Then the computer will play it all simultaneous. I think the best thing would be is if Michael Carlos demonstrates it to you.
In fact, Michael Carlos composed and played the theme for the ABC series Time Lapse entirely on the Fairlight instrument, and by our own piece of electronic wizardry, Michael is here now. Michael, as a musician, how do you feel about the Fairlight?
Well, it's very exciting. A whole new possibilities and avenues of approach are open to the composer.
You don't feel like a technician? You feel like a musician using it?
No, not at all. Don't feel like a technician. No, it's removed most of that because it's a lot simpler to look at than conventional analog synthesizers.
Show us what you can do. Play us a bit of time lapse.
Sure.
Yamaha released the DX7 in 1983, and it quickly rose to take over the airwaves. From Brian Eno to Kenny Loggins, from Herbie Hancock to Whitney Houston, the DX7 was everywhere. It defined the sound of an entire decade and laid the groundwork for some of the ways that synthesizers are still being used today. Let's take a closer look. While the DX7 was released in 1983, its origins date all the way back to 1967. That's when John Chowning, a professor at Stanford University, discovered the algorithm for frequency modulated synthesis. As you might know, sound is caused by vibrations in the air. Each sound creates different waveforms as it goes through the air, which you recognize as sound waves. FM synthesis allowed for more nuanced modulation of these sound waves to create new tones. Analog synthesizers used something called subtractive synthesis, where you started with a complex wave and added filters to subtract from it until you got a sound that you wanted. FM, on the other hand, uses the output of one wavelength to modulate another, like how violinists use their fingers to modulate the tone produced by bowing. The implications of this technology were huge, as they allowed synthesizers to produce a wider range of sounds with a lot more nuance to them. Perhaps most notably, this allowed for synthesizers to easily emulate percussive sounds like marimbas, bells, and xylophones. For a great example of this, check out Axel F, where the DX7 is synthesizing marimbas. After Chowning developed his modulation, he licensed the technology to Yamaha, who would spend the next decade experimenting with it. Finally, in 1983, they released the DX7. With FM synthesis at its core, the DX7 featured a number of operators, which created more modulation possibilities and allowed for a wide array of sounds. The DX7 was also the first programmable FM synthesizer, meaning that people could experiment with it and create custom sounds if they wanted. The versatility and customization of the DX7 are a big reason behind its success. One of its most popular sounds was the electric piano. That sound was bright and deep and became a foundation of more 80s ballads than you can count. Check out Chicago's Hard Habit to Break for a great example of that. But it wasn't just the high end. The DX7 could fill out the low side of a song just as easily. Check out the fretless bass in Take My Breath Away from the Top Gun soundtrack. That soundtrack features another classic example of the DX7's bass capabilities. While the DX7 defined the sound of its era, it was also ahead of its time in a lot of ways. The DX7's voices could be custom programmed by users and stored into an internal RAM storage or external cartridges. You could even get applications so that you could load or save presets onto your home computer. This kind of programming proved challenging for many, but some musicians were able to use it to take the synthesizer to a whole nother level. Probably the most famous of these is Brian Eno. Eno was so good at programming the instrument that he even took to sharing his presets with the world. Check out this page from Keyboard Magazine, where you can see the detailed setting of some of Eno's favorite custom patches. Eno used the DX7 as a music producer and also in his own ambient experiments. You can hear tons of it on his album Apollo, Atmospheres and Soundtracks. Given the time it was released, the versatility of the DX7 was astounding. The digital technology allowed the synthesizer to hold more modulators than analog, which allowed for new levels of precision in the synthesis. This meant the DX7 could be bright and punchy enough to be featured in an upbeat pop song, but warm and complex enough to build slow ballads around, and wide open enough to turn into spacey ambient music. The instrument went out of production in 1989, fittingly signaling the end of the decade that it dominated, but its impact stretched far beyond that. FM synthesis is still being used to this day. Yamaha's Montage featured their most powerful FM engine to date, building off the groundwork that they laid with the DX7. The Yamaha DX7 is an essential part of music history, and there's a good reason why it remains one of the most popular synthesizers ever made.
It all began in the early 1980s when two electronic musical instrument pioneers shared a vision of synthesizers with different manufacturers communicating with each other and connecting to computers through one simple interface. Along with other manufacturers in Japan and the United States, they collaborated to develop the Musical Instrument Digital Interface Specification, or MIDI for short, and then publicly demonstrated the first two products equipped with MIDI technology at the Winter NAMM show in January 1983. Dozens more MIDI-equipped keyboards appeared soon after, but perhaps the biggest impact of this new technology was the introduction of MIDI interfaces and software for personal computers, enabling the recording, editing, and playback of synthesizer performances in a process known as MIDI sequencing. What started as the simple capture of a single keyboard performance quickly grew to the ability to manipulate and orchestrate dozens, then hundreds of tracks and instruments to perform every kind of music imaginable.
This is what the audience will be hearing at the San Francisco Opera House, the full sound of a 44-rank organ. But this is what the musician will be playing, a little Apple IIe computer, plus a hardware-software package called the Cathedral 100. Computers can make beautiful music, as we'll find out today on this edition of the Computer Chronicles.
Gary Leuenberger is a musician, a composer, a writer, and a performer. With a synthesizer, he can mimic any traditional instrument and invent a few new ones as well. The equipment that makes it possible is a combination of software and hardware that communicates with his synthesizer through a musical instrument digital interface, or MIDI port. The process begins on a Macintosh screen with a program called Professional Composer to lay the foundation of the piece. The program counts out and automatically numbers the measures, creating a musical sketch on which to place notes. Gary can then move directly to his keyboard, the output of which feeds into the Mac, again through a MIDI port. Once the rough draft is in the machine's memory, it can be played back and manipulated. Gary uses a digital sequencer with 8 MIDI ports to assign the different voices to 8 separate synthesizers. If he adds a drum part, the MIDI clock will synchronize the beat to the tempo of the piece.
I start the drum machine and I start
When the fine-tuning is completed, the MIDI data goes to a Yamaha digital sequencer, which controls the playback of the completed piece through the 8 synthesizers. Gary can still change the piece at any point or play along in real time.
I'll show you Easy Track. Easy Track is a program sold for $65 in the mega chain stores. With Easy Track, I'm able to start and stop the drum machine within the synthesizer, change patches. That is, this machine sends commands to this synthesizer, which is under the computer, to change patches, make voice changes, and start and stop drum machines, that sort of thing. So I can stop wherever I want to and continue on.
Now give me a quick summary of what Easy Track is doing with the Casio keyboard.
Sure. What Easy Track is able to do is I'm able to turn tracks off and on.
So you really got a recording studio here is what you're doing.
Sorry.
And when you get all these commands together, you play the music back again and maybe record that result in.
Sure. I can start and stop the drum machine and play a part. Keep that, hear that back. You can see the part that I just played there. The stereo outs of this are patched to the stereo inputs of our recording system. The recording system takes the analog information from here, digitizes it, saves it into RAM, and then I can play that back and manipulate that information.
Okay, so it's being captured, the sound's being captured now digitally.
Right, playing from here, I've captured that sound. I can grab a section if I want to. I can zoom in if I want to, take a close look at what I'm about to capture. I can scroll that around, grab a section, listen to that.
So this is sort of like the equivalent of a word processing system, but for music instead.
Right. I can grab a section, place it anywhere else in the song that I'd like to.
So you can take any audio source, put it in here, massage it, play with it, do anything you want with the music.
Max Matthews has already made some amazing contributions to electronic music technology, and he continues to be instrumental in guiding his students today. Miller Puckett is best known for his creation of Max MSP, a visual programming language used for music and multimedia development. Miller earned his undergraduate degree from MIT in 1980 and a PhD from Harvard University in mathematics in 1986. Through the years, composers, performers, software designers, researchers, and artists have used Max MSP for creating interactive software. Miller is also well known for creating an open source software called Pure Data that is very similar to Max MSP. He worked on the development of Pure Data starting in 1994 when he became a member of the faculty in the Department of Music at the University of California, San Diego. Just like Max Matthews, Miller Puckett has already made valuable contributions to electronic music through Max MSP and Pure Data. But he continues to mold the future of electronic music through his teaching at UC San Diego.
Hi, I'm Robert Henke. I'm from Berlin, and I'm using Max since 1992 or something like that. And I make music under my own name and under the name Monolake, and I'm part of the development and specification team of Ableton Live. I'm not a musician, so I can't play any instrument, and I really like the idea of a machine doing things. I like step sequences, I like statistical and stochastic functions for creating clouds of sounds and clouds of events, and I see myself more as someone who is writing a structure, and the structure then creates the music. And Max is pretty much the ideal tool for this kind of thinking. Max is a language, and everyone is using the language in a different way. And I'm always amazed to communicate with other people who are using Max, because we are all using the same tool and we achieve totally different results. And that's very interesting and very inspiring. What I really like on Max is that it has the potential to change the way you think about music. It did this for me. It really freed me from this linear idea of something has a start and an end. And this was a total liberation. Like, I realized more than before that what I'm interested in music is some kind of constantly changing, permutative, endless state. And Max is the ideal tool for something like that. So it's actually a tool for sculpturing music, much more than for recording. My first patches were very small because I worked on a Macintosh Plus and resources were extremely limited. And then my patches became very big because I tried to solve every possible problem with one single big patch. And then my patches became very small again. And what I do these days is really, I try to come up with a patch which solves 90% of what I want to do. And I try to do this within a very short time, so that I spend more time actually making music than programming Max. Because it's a tricky thing with Max. You can spend weeks in refining a patch, and afterwards the idea is so much gone for yourself that now you have the perfect tool, but you're not interested in using it anymore. The biggest mistake one can make is trying to come up with the one single patch which does everything. Make a simple patch and try to work with the single patch for a period of time. Because making a tool is one thing, but mastering a tool and working with a tool is another thing. And if you're constantly creating a new tool, you will never master it. And that's a danger in Max, that the edit button is so close.
More and more people are producing dance music because, firstly, the access to equipment, home computers, whether it's PC or Mac, and the internet make it very accessible for people to get hold of music making equipment, whether it's by purchasing it or illegally downloading. It's available there for people to have a go.
The access to software now, internet is a massive help.
Chances for someone to produce are just, anyone could. If you've got a Mac or a PC, you could download the software and you can knock out your first track in a day. It might not be that great, but you've got the option to learn it and get something down really quickly.
I first got into production probably only about a year ago, or maybe a year and a half ago. I just started just playing around with FL Studio.
I started writing music in 1991. First heard groups like The Prodigy.
It was about 2.5 years ago. I've always been into sort of music and drum and bass in particular.
Yeah, when I heard The Prodigy, I first heard things like Jericho and Charlie, and yeah, it just blew me away. And at the same time, a friend of mine was writing music on a Commodore Amiga computer, and yeah, just showed me what he was doing, and I got into it myself.
When you have a modular synthesizer in front of you, all of a sudden all those dreams of what you could possibly be able to do are all of a sudden there.
The modular stuff was always the unattainable, big room kind of, science laboratory stuff.
I kind of believed that sooner or later soft synths would be as good sounding as the real thing. I've lost that belief now.
Sit in front of a computer and I started to get boring after a while. I'm just not feeling inspired.
But in terms of playing the music, it's just very hard to feel like you're playing a computer.
I mean, there's so many great software synths that sound fantastic, but interfacing with them is just terrible.
Modular synths are totally reliant upon the human interaction.
It sucks doing it with a mouse. It doesn't feel the same as touching something that has a tactile aesthetic appeal to it.
There are many people who are looking for something new. Okay, a modular synth is not really something new, but I said we have to try to make it affordable.
I'd seen modulars and I'd seen them being used, the vintage stuff, but I'd never really thought it's something I could obtain. When I came across the Eurorack stuff, it's just like, this is a lot more accessible.
I looked at the old Moog modular schematics and stuff and went, he did the best he could with what he had because it was 1968.
As far as designing all of these incredible circuits, that's something that's way beyond my expertise. And I think that the guys that can do that they're kind of rock stars in my book.
Engineering was really difficult to do in school. And I could actually, with all the math and stuff, I just wasn't having fun.
I don't have a fancy car or anything, I just have this system, all these synthesizer modules.
It's almost like a fetish thing at the beginning. It's like this amazing machine that these flashing lights and producing this sound. I thought, God, I've got to have one of those.
I mean, I was definitely attracted to the knobs and the blinking lights and the high-tech futurism of it all.
Right from the beginning, I really saw this as a hot rod for music geeks.
I think it's just so personalized, and it makes people feel really proud of their systems and collecting modules.
You have these things that are affecting each other. They're speaking to each other. They're having a conversation,
which is exactly what a modular synthesizer is.
Accidents are plentiful and are often very satisfying.
What you see now is just an explosion of ideas coming from all around how to connect to this stuff. You see video modules, you see audio modules, you see people connecting like membranes to the brain and controlling the voltage control. The revolution is here.
We always thought of technology as this linear progression, and we were always, because it was new, looking for the next thing and going forward. And, you know, you'd wake up every day and it would change. And now I think we have a depth of experience and history that people are starting to look at the root system of the whole phenomenon and saying, I want to get my hands on, you know, that early experience that was so exciting.
This new world changes always, because even the history of the world is a sine wave and continues to be a sine wave.
I think it's important for both creative people and for cultures in general to re-examine and learn from history and learn from their past. And with the modular synthesizer, the fact that it is now back available, it gives musicians the opportunity to go into the silence of their minds and come out with new and wonderful music and sounds that have never been heard before.